Wisconsin Peoples and Federal Indian Policy. This is a three-part talk I'm going to be giving, 3 separate PowerPoints, in which I will lay out the legal history of treaty making from the European arrival up to about the 1850s. We're going to be using Wisconsin tribes as a focus of this discussion. It's best if you've already read Robert Beder's chapter on the arrival of the French and, as an option, Patty Lowe's chapter on European arrivals. These books will give you additional context as I discuss the shifting nature of Wisconsin's indigenous landscape and the cultural differences that influenced how each side saw treaty making. We're going to start with a framework which was created by Vine Deloria and Clifford Lytle in their book American Indians, American Justice. And they outlined 6 periods of federal Indian policy that characterized by the impact of federal actions for trying to resolve what was typically called the American Indian problem. And so in this first part, we're going to be looking at the discovery, conquest, and treaty-making era. But I want to start first with what is actually a treaty. It's pretty basic. It's an agreement between 2 sovereign powers. Now, when the Europeans first made contact with the Indians, they usually, though not always, treated them as sovereign, independent nations, much like European nations such as France, Spain, and Great Britain. So they had power unto themselves. No one gave them that power. This is an important point to recognize. They were sovereign powers. And the European countries and the Indian tribes often would make treaties, principally to cement military alliances and political alliances, as well as to make peace between tribes as well as between the Europeans and the Indians. So the first point here is that these tribes were treated as sovereign powers, and this notion, as we'll talk about a little bit, was written into the U.S. Constitution in 1787. When the Europeans came, the native peoples already had experience with holding councils and making treaties. They didn't call them that. But they would come up with oral agreements, nothing written at the time, to make these agreements implicit and continuing. They would create wampum belts that would be used to finalize the treaty. And here we have an agreement between the Hurons and the Jesuits in 1683, where the Jesuits agreed to build a church. And you can see this belt here made from shells from the Long Island Sound, which indicated that the church, you can see the church on the side there, and the 2 people coming together with a cross in the middle. As Robert Beder so well documents, the first major European impact on Wisconsin indigenous came from the French, noted on this map by the exploratory journey of Jean Nicolet. So let's review a little bit the territorial location of these tribes at the time of his visit. So the Great Lakes tribes prior to the European invasion, to the best of our knowledge, are represented here, with their general regions identified by numbers and colors. If you zero in on Wisconsin, you'll see there are only 4 tribes with ancestral ties to the land. We have the Ho-Chunk, often called Winnebago. We have the Menominee, the Iowa, and the Santee, a band of the Sioux tribe, are oftentimes together now lumped together as the Lakota. So that's significant in and of itself, because if you think about Wisconsin tribes today, you probably think of quite a few others. I'll point out then where these tribes are and what's going to happen later. So here we have the Ojibwe. You'll notice that they are in what is today Canada, separated by Lake Superior. So they are not initially a Wisconsin so-called tribe. I also wanted to point out that here you see the Potawatomi, which are in Michigan. Also, the French, biggest ally, were the Huron, and they are controlling the northern regions, the northern shore of Lake Ontario. That's the big ally for the French, and the major ally for the British eventually would be the Iroquois, made up of 5 and then eventually 6 separate tribes in the New York region. The Iroquois would be, of course, known for being control of the fur trade and leading to the near decimation of the Huron tribe in the wars for the control of that trade. So by 1760, by the time England and France had settled the issue of who would control North America with the victory of the English over the French in what was called the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, this is now the makeup of where the major tribes were situated. So you'll first of all notice that the Ottawa had been pushed into Michigan. Again, all of these tribes are moving westward in many respects, sometimes because of the Iroquois, or because they had decimated the fur trade and they're moving further west to get access to beaver fur. That pushed the Potawatomi down into southern Michigan and into the Indiana Territory, and then you can see all the way up into the shore of Lake Michigan and Wisconsin, which further then compressed the Winnebago, who put pressure on the Menominee. And then notice also the Ojibwe, the Sioux are almost now completely pushed out of Wisconsin, and they're being pushed out by the Ojibwe, who again have moved into this region to control the fur trade in that part, and also to maintain their great ties with the French. So that's the layout, and you should get an idea right away that this is a very fluid region, and it's being caused by wars, the Beaver Wars, global war for control of North America, as well as tribal contentions for various reasons, but mostly for the fur trade. During the American Revolution, the Second Continental Congress created a trio of Indian-related agencies, the most significant being Ben Franklin and Patrick Henry appointed as commissioners to negotiate treaties with Native Americans to obtain their neutrality during the Revolution. Now, the British biggest ally were the Iroquois, and many Menominee bands also supported the British, while other Western tribes, including some Menominee, chose to stay out of the war altogether. It was probably a wise decision because in the end, let me just finish this. The United States made its first treaty with the Delaware in 1778. So during the Revolution, the United States viewed itself as a sovereign power, and they negotiated a treaty with the Delaware. The last treaty officially was made in 1868, when the policy of treaty making was ended. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Now, getting back to the Revolution, the Treaty of Paris in 1783, negotiated between the British, the French, the Spanish, the Americans, significantly left out any indigenous people. So all the people who inhabited those lands were not part of the process. This is a key point to remember, because the treaty itself did not grant the United States ownership of these lands, but the exclusive rights to negotiate with the Indians for them. So that meant the French or the Spanish or the British were not allowed to negotiate with the Indians. This gave the United States kind of a monopoly of control, but it did not give them access to the land immediately. This did not preclude the United States from creating its own blueprint for settling what was then called the Northwest Territory, as shown by this map. The scheme of plotting the land to ranges to townships down to 40 acres was the brainchild of Thomas Jefferson. So it was clear that the U.S. had designs for this land. How they would get it was yet to be determined. Immediately, the first administration under George Washington sought to move into the region with a military force to intimidate the Indians and to force open particularly the Ohio Valley, which was seen as the most settlement-ready area. And that had been something of Washington's desires from the 1760s. So they sought to push the Indians out of this region, and they were met with a great deal of hostility. Americans suffered two humiliating defeats because their military was basically not strong enough, and there was a Western Confederacy of tribes that were united to prevent the Americans from moving forward. However, the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 of August was a decisive victory for the United States, and this ended the major hostilities in the region. That is until Tecumseh's War and the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803 would open the door to even more settlement of the Northwestern Territories and place additional pressures on Wisconsin tribes to make room for this expanding power from the east. And that is the conclusion of part 1.